Hey friends, I'm Daniel Nesbitt, and welcome to a new series on designing your first font in Glyphs Mini. I've been meaning to make this for a little bit now after noticing at the start of 2022 that a number of people on my social media feeds had been expressing interest in creating their first typeface, and I thought, well, what better way than to create a new series based on that? So I chose Glyphs Mini for a few reasons, but notably there's a couple of them. Number one is the cost, and I've mentioned this before in previous series. It doesn't look like it's really changed since I started this one here and as of this recording. But for about $50 you can get a copy of Glyphs Mini. This is comparable to something like FontSelf, which is a plugin that you can use in Illustrator or Photoshop. But that's actually the second reason why I chose this versus something like FontSelf, is that Glyphs Mini is the younger sibling to the full version of Glyphs, which I typically use on a lot of my other typeface videos on this channel. The benefit of this is that what you learn in Glyphs Mini can be applied directly to Glyphs if you decide to continue pursuing typeface design. This does mean that Glyphs Mini does not have as many bells and whistles as the full version of Glyphs, but there's just enough here to get you started with your first typeface. So that's kind of my primary reasons for choosing this. There are other options out there, notably Font Forge, which is free, which is very accessible for a lot of people because, free is always a good price. But I feel like something like this is a little more in line with getting started. I think the folks at Glyphs have done a wonderful job making this version of Glyphs Mini very accessible, particularly for those who may not be used to a proper font editor. So, with that out of the way, I wanted to get a few things taken care of before we get into drawing letters. And so what we're going to do is, if you don't have it open already and you're on your computer following along, I'm going to go to the Font Info tab here, which you can either press Command-I on your keyboard or hit the little I icon in the upper corner there. Now, something that I've really started doing over the last 6 months or so is using a grid to start designing my typeface. And I've found that this is actually extremely helpful because the idea behind creating a good font is creating repetition, rhythm, that things are predictable. And if we just go and use the default settings in Glyphs or Glyphs Mini, you get a lot of freeform stuff going on, and I find that difficult to work with. So the settings that I have on my screen here, and I will be sharing these files as we go through this series, so don't worry if you don't get all these settings. But basically, all of these here, these numbers that you see on the screen, are multiples of 7. That's what we'll be going off of here. So my alignment zones, the 14 is something that we'll use for overshoot. That'll be 14 or 14 units for overshoot, which we'll get into what that means in a moment here. But then we've got numbers like 700, 490, 735, negative 210. All of these relate to all the different measurements that we'll have in our typeface. And then a little bit further down at the bottom here, we've got 1050 as our units per M, again, multiple of 7. And then a grid spacing of 35 that is subdivided into 7 smaller grids. So there's going to be a few grids going on here that we'll keep track of in a moment, and I promise this will be less confusing than it looks. But this is the settings that I'm going to be using for this typeface. So we're going to close out of that, and then jumping in here, the big question is, as a starting typeface designer, is what letter do you start with? Now, if you've gotten to this point, maybe you've drawn a few characters, you're really excited about it, but there's 4 letters that I really want to draw your attention to. These are what we're going to call the control characters, and the benefit of drawing these characters right away is that you have enough DNA by creating these letters that you can go on to create other letters from those letters. And that's really the whole secret, well, I shouldn't say the whole secret, but it's one of the big secrets behind designing type, is that we try and rip off elements of other characters to create new characters. And this creates that rhythm, that repetition that your eye wants when you're looking at a typeface. So those letters that we'll be focusing on will be the capital O, the capital H, the lowercase n, and the lowercase o, and it spells oh no, which is kind of a fun way to remember it. Now personally, I like to start on the lowercase, so I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to double click into the lowercase n because I feel like the square letter is a little bit easier to get started with. Now you notice when I click in here that we've got a few bands across the top of the screen here, and this is those alignment zones that we were looking at a little bit earlier, those 14 units. That's what creates these bigger bands here. And the idea is that there's kind of a fainter line that you can see to one side of these, which is where things like our straight lines are going to go. So the vertical stem of the N here is only going to go to the bottom of this band and the top of this band, versus something like the curve in the N, that's going to go to the top of this band, or if it was a O, the bottom curve of that O would go below on the bottom part of this band here. And effectively what we're doing is we're creating a little bit of visual trickery, because your eye looks at a square and a circle. If they were mathematically the same size to your eye, they would look smaller. So we use a little bit of an optical illusion by making that circle shape a little bit larger to trick your eye into thinking that a circle is the same size as a square. And you'll notice that there's going to be a lot of that in type design. So that's kind of the setup down here. Underneath where we're going to be drawing, we've got a little info palette here. So this will make more sense as we move on, but I just want to highlight that for now. And then across the top here, we've got our tools. So we've got a selection tool, a pen tool, there's an eraser tool, and a pencil tool, neither of which I'll probably be using that much, if at all. We have a primitive tool, which allows you to draw a rectangle or a circle, a rotate button, a scale button, a text button, which you can use to start typing out letters as we create more of those. There is a hand tool or a pan tool, but usually I just use the spacebar on my keyboard to move around. There's a zoom tool, and then a measurement tool, so we can measure the shapes that we draw. I'm a bit of a keyboard warrior myself, so I do have a little shortcut preview down in the corner here. This isn't a Glyphs feature, but you can see what I'm pushing on my keyboard as we go through and design a letter here. And then off to the side, we've got a handy little panel here. So the first thing up at the top here is we have a dimensions panel, and this is effectively a very fancy notepad. So if you have a certain measurement for a stem or a circle or something like that, you can kind of keep track of your measurements up here. There's a fit curve palette, which we'll get to when we start drawing some of the circular shapes, but this is a lot of fun to play with. And then below that, we've got a transformations panel here. So this works similar to your rotate and your scale tools up here, except you get a little bit more control. You can actually input certain things. If you want to do 10% scale and then scale up or scale down, you can do that. And the grayed out box here means that it's going to scale 10% evenly in each direction. There's a little lock button here, so if you wanted to scale 10%, I think this goes horizontal then vertical, you could do 10% in the horizontal direction and 20% in the vertical direction. And then below this, we've got a rotate option here, so we could type in a very specific unit of measurement. We could do 15 degrees, and now when I click either of these buttons, it'll rotate 15 degrees in the corresponding direction. And then we've got a slant tool where I can type in degrees of slants. So for example, if I wanted to do 5 degrees of tilt in whatever I draw, I can type in 5, and then same as the rotate button, pushing either one of these either goes 5 degrees to the left or 5 degrees to the right. And then last below that, and probably something you'd be familiar from Illustrator, we've got some alignment options here where you can do left, center, and right, or top, middle, bottom. And then below that, we've just got some basic pathfinding tools where you can add, subtract, and I think this is this divide. I always forget the specific name of this one, but those are the main tools that we've got here that we'll use to create our typeface. One other thing that I'll point out is along the very, very bottom of your window is we've got a couple icons here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click the I button, and what this does is this actually opens up a panel, and nothing's going to be in here yet, but as we start drawing our character up here, we're going to get a preview of it down here. And I like having this feature enabled because it usually allows me to see things at a different size as I draw. This is particularly useful if you're intending to use your font at multiple sizes, which I imagine you would be. As you draw, you get a quick kind of preview or visual of how that's working out. All right, so with all that out of the way, we're ready to start drawing, almost. So I mentioned earlier that I have a lot of grids going on here, and my goal behind this is that I want to start very large, blocky, and just kind of, not very high res, I guess is probably the right way to phrase it. And then as we kind of get the basic bones of this letter constructed, then we start refining, which is why I have multiple grids going on here. But there's actually one additional grid that I'm going to be using to start with that isn't really obvious right away on here. So rather than using this big, coarse, darker grid that you see in the background, I'm actually going to take one step back and do, it's a 70 unit by 70 unit basically pixel that I'm going to be working with here. This is a little bit coarser than that 35 by 35 that I put in the font settings. But basically I'm going to be using this to start to rough out the basic shapes of my letter forms here. So effectively it's kind of like a pixel font in a way. And I'm just using the rectangle tool to create these shapes right now. So to start with, we're going to try and keep things 70 units wide in this case, or tall if I was going the other direction. And we're just going to start creating a letter here. So we're going to copy and paste this. Now, to note when you copy and paste things, that Glyphs usually pastes whatever you're copying over the thing you're copying it from. So you may have to click and drag things away. But we can go through and we can just use our selection tool to kind of drag and drop. You'll notice that a lot of this probably feels pretty similar to Adobe Illustrator. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this second vertical stroke here, and I'm going to, just for the sake of having a visual here, we're going to pretend that we're on this 70 unit by 70 unit grid. And effectively what I'm going to do is I'm going to start thinking about the negative space that I've got going on here. So using my coarser grid, I want to have basically 3 pixels or 3 coarse units between this stroke and this stroke. And this is going to be a recurring theme as we start going through some of the other letters as well. But that's the idea here, is that we've kind of got 3 of these big, huge, coarse units of space between my 2 strokes. And then the next thing we're going to do, because we want to create an N here, is I'm going to take this and I'm just going to drag it down. Let's go maybe here. So this is where I'm going to start breaking away from the grid a little bit, because from the top of my X height further down here, effectively I've got 2.5 units of space. So we're starting to kind of get into that 35 unit grid a little bit, but I'm not going to fully commit to that right away. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab my pen tool and we're going to draw that arc of the N. So when I do this, I usually don't pay too much attention to being specific with my lines here. I'm just trying to get the points roughly where I want them. And then once I have this kind of set up here, then it's a matter of just kind of going and moving points around. Now to keep things easy, I'm not going to start making curves yet. I just want to deal with straight lines. So effectively what we're going to have here when I'm done is something that's just very blocky, very primitive. That's kind of the main goal behind what I'm doing here. And for something like a curve, you can kind of think about how this line here should probably be about as thick as this line visually. If it's not, we can kind of move it around a little bit. And you'll notice as I'm drawing, we're also getting a preview down here too, so I'm actually keeping an eye on how this is looking down here. Sometimes changing the scale of what you're drawing can maybe help you out a little bit in determining if you're on the right path or not. And then the other thing that we're going to do here is I'm just going to move this up And we don't want to make this line quite so thick moving into the vertical stroke here. So something that you'll notice type designers often do is they'll actually have this stroke kind of thin out a little bit. And the idea is that we don't want to create a very heavy space where two perpendicular lines join together. So a common trick you'll see in type design is that these lines kind of thin out a little bit, just to make it appear, again, kind of that optical illusion thing. We give the appearance that there's kind of the same line weight going on here when in reality it's not. Now some typefaces do play with this and they do take it to an extreme where it looks something like it gets really thin. So you can create some unique typefaces there, and maybe we do kind of bump that up a little bit, but these are just kind of fun ways that you can make your typeface look a little more unique, is by kind of playing with some of these variables. So we'll kind of get something like that. And again, I'm just kind of playing around with making sure this line tapers in a little bit, and that this line is approximately the same weight as this line. So you'll notice that it looks a bit choppy though. It's very square, very primitive. Looks maybe like an old Nintendo 64 graphic kind of going on here. But I think I'm pretty happy with how this curve looks. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to turn these into curves. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Option key with my Select tool active, and I'm going to click on all of these lines. And what you'll notice is that handles start to appear in a few different places here. And this is how we get the Bezier curves that we're looking for, that you're probably familiar with in something like Illustrator. So what we'll do here is we're just going to go and we're going to kind of drag these out. And to get started, I'm just going to try and keep things in 90-degree pairs here. So we're not going to have any odd angles or anything like that. I just want to have these line up directly straight across. Now for over here where it kind of stabs in a little bit, I may break my rule already a little bit and not necessarily have these at a 90-degree angle. But we'll kind of get these. Ideally, I want to keep these two as parallel as I can, so that it kind of has a nice curve here. And one thing I can do, and already this is where something like Glyphs really outshines a vector program like Illustrator, is that I can actually manipulate the handles like I could a point. So I can actually select two handles. I could select more than two handles, and using the arrow keys on my keyboard, I can nudge this around. It's really kind of cool how you can move things around a little bit. It's quite a bit more powerful than your typical like vector application like Adobe Illustrator. And it's one of the reasons why I encourage people to draw their type in something like Glyphs or a font editor, because a lot of these programs just give you so much more control over how you're drawing your shapes. So from this point, I'm just going to go through and we'll kind of get these curves pulled out a little bit. And effectively what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to keep these 2 points here, these two perpendicular handles, at approximately a 45-degree angle away from each other to create a smooth curve. I don't have an exact science to this, but you kind of get the idea that's going on here. And then the other thing that I'm going to do too is I'm actually going to try and keep this inner curve a little bit tighter than the outer curve as well, so that this line feels consistent all the way around. So if I zoom out a little bit, one thing that happened when we drew this line is that this started to feel thicker than here. And so we'll need to address that. There's a couple ways to do this, but I think the easiest way is probably just to take this here and just move up the bottom part of this curve. So one thing I can do is I can hold the space key down to keep my large letter here in preview mode, And I can actually use my arrow keys to kind of bump things up a little bit, and it allows me to preview as I work here. So I can kind of get an idea for how this is looking. Another thing that I'm looking at is that there feels like there's kind of a dent here. And this is yet another feature that I love in Glyphs, is I can select this point here, and if I hold down the Option key, I can actually move the point independent of the handle, and it actually creates a little bit of a smoother curve. So by doing this kind of stuff, you'll notice that now this feels a bit smoother as we kind of exit from this curve and then into the straight line here. So with that out of the way, I think this is looking pretty decent. We've got a nice curve going on here. I could go back and maybe make a few adjustments just to kind of get this curve maybe a little bit in a better place. But you'll see that we've got like a nice arc going on here. Some other fun things that we could probably do is maybe bump this in a little bit more, just to kind of create a little bit more of an obvious that this is arcing in. I could also move this back a little bit, maybe just make that line a little bit thicker. And really all we're doing is we're just focusing on creating a nice clean arc and a nice clean curve there. I don't think that looks too bad. Of course, the undo button is your friend. If you don't like how something looks, you can always go and undo things. Now, one other thing that is optional for a lowercase n, and you could also potentially use this in something like an M or a U, but I can take this vertical stroke here, and if I add a point there, something you can do just for a little bit of fun is just kind of nudge the top of that over a little bit so it kind of opens up this space a little bit more. Sometimes I like to do this just to give it a little bit of kind of visual interest. It's not really something that you're gonna like full on notice, but I kind of like how it gives a little bit of an appearance on this end. So with that out of the way, the last thing that I'm going to focus on is spacing. And just to get started, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to those course units that we were working with earlier, 70, and I'm just going to do 70 units of space to either side of the N. Now, if I press the T button on the T key on my keyboard, what I can do is if I push the N a couple times, you'll notice that we start to get a pair of N's on the screen here, and this will be more helpful as we go through other letters. You can start creating words, which is ultimately the goal here, is we want to start creating enough letters that we can create some words, because that's how you use a font, is with words. And the quicker that we can get this into words, the quicker we can see how things are looking, how they're shaping up, if they're working or if they're not. But I'd say this looks pretty good for the N. Now, what we can do is we can go through, and I'm going to go to the M next. So if we double click actually into the N, I'm going to do a select all, Command A, copy, and then over in my N, we're going to paste it in there. So what we can do, like I said earlier, is type is all about copying and pasting, and that's exactly what we're doing here. Now, the other thing that I want to keep in mind with the M is actually that it's a little bit narrower in these negative spaces here, because the N doesn't need to be the same inner width here. We're going to start thinking about some negative space in addition to the positive spaces that we're creating. So this is where that finer 35 unit grid comes into place, because I'm going to take 135 unit grid space out. So rather than having 6 of these spaces, we're going to go down to 5. And then what I'm going to do before I copy and paste this curve over is we're going to adjust this. And Just move that there. We'll move these over. And you may need to adjust things a little bit. Maybe these handles get a little bit shorter. Maybe this comes up a little bit, just to kind of help it out. There's going to be a little bit of trial and error here, but that's okay. But effectively what we're trying to do is we're just trying to get that curve kind of back to a nice smooth feel that this one has as well, which I think we've got pretty well here. So once I'm happy with that, we'll go ahead, we'll copy and paste this over. And looks like I may need to adjust this just a tiny bit, but that's okay. So we'll go through and we'll just close that gap up there a little bit. And then in the kerning down here, I could go and I could keep typing 70 and 70, but I'm all about shortcuts, as you've probably noticed by this point. So what we can do is we can actually tell the kerning units down here, or the spacing units, I should say, is that we want to steal the spacing from the N. And so each one of these boxes corresponds to the left and the right, but now what this is saying is that whatever I set my units to on the N, the M is automatically going to assume those same units. And that's really cool because as we go further along in this process, we may change our mind about how this is spaced. We might start kind of figuring how this starts to kind of firm up a little bit in terms of our spacing. And so this is a great way that you don't have to go back through every single letter of the alphabet to change things. You can just continue to change it on one and have Glyphs take care of all the heavy lifting for you. One other letter that we'll focus on here is the U. And what we'll do is we'll actually try something a little bit different here. So rather than copying and pasting, which you could do, there's another thing we can do, which is we can add a component. And I know this sounds a little bit strange because we're going to copy and paste a letter effectively, but any space, anything that you've got in your main font editor window, you can use as a component. And this is really helpful if you're doing something like a serif where you're going to have a repeated shape across many letters, like the foot serif or something like that. You can do all sorts of things to kind of reduce and reuse a lot of different things when you're designing a typeface. But for this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to go up to Glyph, we're going to add a component, and I'm going to just type the letter N, so we get that. If I hit select, it's just going to automatically put it here. And then what I can do is I can use my mirroring tools and actually just go ahead and flip it upside down until it's a U. Now it automatically assumes all of my my spacing that I had set up on the N, and there's really nothing that I would absolutely have to do if I didn't want to do anything different. We could just make the U an upside down N and leave it at that. I will be honest though, as you get further along into font design, that there are some things that you want to do to tweak the U and make it a little bit more unique from the N. There's a bunch of different optical things that you can adjust and change to make this work. For the sake of what we're doing here today though, we're just going to leave it as an upside down N. I may come back to that later in the series and make some of those adjustments, but for now, we're just focusing on our first typeface. The last letter that we're going to work on is the I. Now, unlike the M and the U, where I could either just rotate it or lightly manipulate it, we've got to create some new things here. So, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to my N, and I'm going to grab the left vertical stroke. We're going to paste it in here, and then I'm just going to make this a square again. So we're going to take that little notch that I had out of there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a square dot on the I. And we're going to do 80 by 80. I like to have a little bit of overhang to either side if I can. Sometimes I have to adjust this a little bit. But I like to make the dot just a little bit heavier if I can. And maybe because of my grid here, that might actually prevent me from doing that the way I want, which is fine. Sometimes that happens. That is the one drawback of working with a grid like this. But I do want it to feel a little bit heavier than that, so what I might actually do is maybe just make it a little bit taller. And that might actually just kind of get me to where I want to be. And same as before with the M, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to steal the side bearings of the N for now. So I chose these 3 letters because I can create a word from this, and I only had to draw 3 to do it. So minimum is the word that I was going for. And the benefit to getting to this stage is that I can now write something that I can read and understand. And this is where I can really start to critique things and determine how is my typeface working so far. We only have a couple basic shapes here, but already we can create a word. We can look at this, we can kind of judge it with our reading eyes. Are things consistent, like the arches of the M and the N and the U? And in this case, we know that they are because it's just a copy and paste. We've got something like the I here, which kind of breaks up the rhythm a little bit, that we don't have the negative spaces that the M and the U and the N have. So we can really start to determine how things are working. And if something needs to change, we're early on in the process that we can go back and we can adjust these things, we can change them. And this is really the benefit of getting things into a word right away, is that you start to view things not on a letter-by-letter basis, but now we start to think about it on a word-by-word basis. And this is kind of that core foundation of how you make a good typeface, is how is all this working together? Matthew Carter has the famous quote that it's not a collection of beautiful letters. A font is a beautiful collection of letters, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. So if something's not working, you don't want to get most of the way through your alphabet and determine that you wanted to change something. We can kind of take these baby steps here and really focus on what we're doing, so that by the time we get closer to the end of this, that you've got something that you're happy with. One other letter that we'll do, that we'll leave this first episode on because it probably is getting a little bit lengthy, is I'm going to go ahead and do the H here. And again, this is just kind of recapping a lot of what we already worked on. So I'm going to just use the shortcut to add a component, which is Shift-Command-C. But we'll go ahead and we're going to do that N. And one last thing that I'm going to show you is, unlike the U, we can't just rotate this or scale it or anything like that to create an H. We actually need to edit this. So what I can do is I can click on the N, because right now I can't edit this. This is just going to be a carbon copy. Whatever I do here is going to appear on the N. And you'll notice even my U updates as I move this around as well, which is kind of cool, and it's great if you want to have something that's going to repeat like that you can edit in one spot and it auto updates on the others. But for the case of the H, we don't want this update to appear anywhere else. We don't want to adjust our N to make that. So what we'll do is I'm going to click on this, and if I right click or control click if you don't have right click and hit decompose, what this effectively does is pretty much gives me the full editor back again. And now any changes that I make here are only going to be on this letter. They're not going to update anywhere else. So what we're going to do is similar to the I. We're just going to go ahead and make this square again without that little notch. I can take these 2 points along the top here, and then we're just going to drag them up to the bottom of this very top line, because this top line here is our ascender measurement. The one right below that is for the caps, which we'll get to a little bit later. But effectively we've got that H now. And then because this is no longer a copy of the N, I've just got to go through and tell Glyphs to reference the side bearings of the N on this H. So as I update them here, of course, they'll update it on the H as well. And so there we go, our first few characters in Glyphs Mini. And hopefully this felt easy to kind of jump into and get into. The letters that I chose are obviously very simple and easy to get started with, and I actually like that because once you start getting into things like curves and whatnot, things can get very complicated very quickly. But I think just focusing on these couple of letters to start will really help you kind of start to figure out what's working and what's not. You can have a lot of fun with these. You can add serifs. You can, think about how some of these curves might work. There's a lot of ways that you can get really creative with this, and ultimately, you can kind of play around with it, but you can see how, if, for example, the curve on an N, how's that going to translate to an H or a U? And very quickly, you can kind of determine what's working and what's not with your typeface. So like I said, we'll leave it here for this video. If you are enjoying this, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. If you know somebody who's trying to get started with Glyphs Mini with their first font, feel free to share this video as well. It always helps to see the channel grow and to see more folks maybe find these things kind of useful. So with that, if you have anything in the that you would do differently, or maybe you have kind of a unique way of starting, leave your ideas and your thoughts in the comment section below. It's always fun to get other folks' perspectives on this, and to see maybe how you would approach something like this. I will have a GitHub repository, and the link will be in the description of this video if you want to either take a look at what I've created here, or I'll also include a blank file as well. If you want to just use my settings and start from scratch with something of your own, I'll have those resources in the description for you to take a look at. So as always, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.